Hi, everyone. Had a chance to have a discussion with Professor Richard Wolff about the housing crisis. We're talking mostly about building housing, people being able to afford housing, etc. But this discussion went all over, and we ended up at military-industrial complex malfeasance and what the reputation of the United States in the rest of the world is coming to. I hope you enjoy it. Don't forget to subscribe to both my channel, act.tv's channel, and Democracy at Work. Hi, everyone. I am happy to have Professor Richard Wolff with me today. Hi, Professor Wolff. How are you?
Okay. Glad to be here, Julianna.
There are so many things going on, but one of the things that are being reported on right now is the housing crisis. Could you explain to us what is going on here in America and how it fits in to the crumbling of capitalism?
Sure, I'd be glad to. First of all, the big picture. We've just been, as a society, through an absolute trauma, and it isn't over. And I don't just mean the COVID disaster, basically running from March of 2020 into May now of 2021. So 14 months or however you want to count it. But let's remember, we've had the worst public health crisis in a century happening together with the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Both of those events happened separately. This time, we have both of those kinds of events at the same time. There's no precedent for this. And for folks to imagine with wishful thinking that we're going to somehow snap right out of this and get right, quote, back to normal is naive. It's kind of silly. Everything was put on hold. Businesses closed down. Educations stopped. Projects were halted in the middle. And these include the building of houses, the cultivation of lumber from tree stands, and 1,000 other aspects. That's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that we have what we call a private enterprise economy. And one of the things that means is that we have no overarching planning agency. Nobody, not at the federal level, not at the state level, not at the local level, has any real ongoing responsibility for coping with this kind of disaster. I mean, we know that because here we are, one of the richest countries in the world with 4% of the world's population, and we've suffered 20% of the world's deaths from COVID. Obviously, we really messed up in preparing for and managing the COVID disaster. But I'm afraid I have to tell you as an economist that we didn't do any better on the economic disaster. It's just you don't see it right away, the way you see dead bodies piling up, in trailer truck bodies outside of hospitals in New York City and so on. So what we're seeing now is the equivalent, the delayed consequences of an unplanned economic and public health crisis. So, for example, millions of people decided not to sell their house because in the middle of the COVID crisis, they couldn't literally let anyone come into their house, let alone look at it, let alone go through all of the material activities necessary to sell a house. So people put on hold their plans to sell. Likewise, people had to put on hold their plans to buy. Lumber companies could not gather people together to cut the wood or to process it. Everything got messed up. And it's going to take years, let me stress that, to unwind the combination of this COVID plus economic crash on the one hand, and the failure to plan, to figure it out, to take the appropriate steps over the last 14 months So now suddenly there's this surge of people who want to buy a home who postponed it. The people who are selling are wondering, ooh, maybe I shouldn't sell now. Maybe the prices are going up, so it would be smarter for me to wait a little while. I can stay in my house. So you get this imbalance between sellers and buyers. But before anybody gets too excited, that can reverse very quickly and you can get to the other extreme. So what you have really, if you think about it, is enormous instability and uncertainty. And I wish I had better news, but that's the reality of an economic system of the sort we live in.
You know, there's been mass exoduses from large urban centers, New York City, San Francisco, LA, some of the other large urban centers. And my experience is I have friends who've moved out of New York just within the last year, and their real estate agents are calling them to see if they would like to sell because they'll get a huge price. It's basically flipping the home. None of the people I know just, you know, they went to escape a pandemic. They didn't go because they wanted to flip a house.
Right.
What effect do you think migration out of these large cities has had on the lack of, I mean, we're talking about unaffordable housing to the mass of people in the United States, and then we'll start talking about where are the working class people, where are the minimum wage people, where are they living? So let's start with the exodus, and then we can move on to those people who can't afford a down payment, etc.
Well, you know, the Exodus issue is itself an example of the uncertainty I'm talking about. On the one hand, the people who left may decide, and I really underscore may decide, that they want to stay where they moved to. They want to now become suburban or rural or wherever they went to. Either because they like that.
It's the driveway, really. I am one of those people, and just having a place to park the car.
Right. They may like that.
I'm staying.
Right. They might like to be near the country. They might like to go for walks in woods. You know, that's all possible. But there is no reason, and I really want people to be careful here. There's no reason to assume that will swamp an alternative, which is, I'm living in the country, and now I realize why I lived in the city, and I want to go back to the city. Is it safe? Again, a question that has no certain answer. So you're going to see family by family agonizing over this, understandably, but coming up with very different decisions. Meanwhile, you've got the people who build housing. If the price goes up, they're going to see profits gleaming, so they're going to build housing. Yet, on the other hand, the lumber price has gone crazy. The building costs have gone crazy. So everyone, and that's, again, I want to stress, in our capitalist system, it's everybody on their own. And none of us know how all of us are going to be acting, but we depend for our decisions on what other people's decisions are. That's why you have coordination. No business, no large business in this country would ever run itself the way we run the economy as a whole. If you look at Apple or Amazon or IBM or General Motors, these are highly planned institutions. They denounce planning outside of themselves, but they practice it inside themselves because they know that if they dared not do it, they'd be destroyed by an event like now. They would have too many cars they couldn't sell, or too few cars, and they wouldn't be able to sell and keep their position in the market. So they plan and they take every contingency into account that they can. But in a larger economy where we, the consumer and the working class, have to live, we are surrounded by a level of uncertainty that makes rational planning virtually impossible. And that gives a kind of herky-jerky quality to our lives, which takes its toll on our physical and mental health as well.
So true. Professor Wolff, under President, there was a new article out in The Nation about just exactly how President Trump left it to the market to decide how we were going to deal with COVID and the economic fallout, not only just the pandemic itself, but the economic fallout. And we're living through that. Is that as close as we've ever gotten in the United States to like a full-on libertarian type of world where they just said, we're not going to get involved. You guys figure it out for yourselves?
Yeah, it's about as extreme as we've dared let it go. And it was under very special circumstances that we even did that. And as I said at the beginning, we are going to be paying the price for this extraordinary experiment for a long time. Let me give you an example that happened this morning to me. I'm communicating with a professor of economics like myself in Brazil. Brazil is being ravaged by the COVID. I mean, it's like India. It's just a terrible, even worse than the United States in terms of the number of people dying and getting sick. And we went back and forth, and I made some comment about Biden, with all of his limitations. At least the vaccination process seems to be moving along in the United States. I meant no disrespect, but wow, did I get back. This is a person with whom I have a very good relationship. I like him. He likes, we like each other's work. That's why we have a relationship. But he kept his politeness, but he kept saying, look, don't take this personally, but don't write that kind of email to anybody else here in Brazil. And then he unloaded because he said, we're reading in the newspapers how you're vaccinating everybody, even teenagers who are not really susceptible to this disease. I mean, there are a few, but in general, they're healthier and their bodies are stronger and they can handle this virus better than people that are older and all the rest. He says, we don't even have vaccines for the people on the front line. The hospital, the nurses, the doctors, the folks that have to take a risk every day to help the millions of Brazilians that are getting sick. We don't have the vaccine, and we don't have it because your country, U.S., is not exporting the vaccines. There's no calculus. It's as if everybody else in the world doesn't count. And then he ended with the sentence I'm going to repeat to you now. There is going to be hostility towards the United States for generations as people here in Brazil tell each other why their cousin or their grandma died because the Americans had a vaccine that they were storing millions of doses that they couldn't even find their own citizens to take, while we couldn't even give the doctors we depend on the vaccine. I mean, whoa, talk about long-term effects of Mr. Trump's failure to prepare for or to cope with this. You're seeing them, and we're going to be living them out in ways we won't even see half the time. Why a problem we're having is traceable back to the failures we are in the midst of living through now.
It's interesting because President Biden has been inching closer to removing patent restrictions on vaccines so other countries can make their own. That is a huge step that is really kind of not very popular with the pharmaceutical industry. Can you talk about what he is facing in terms of making that decision? He was very popular with the pharmaceutical industry, and now this is not going over well for him.
Well, I think that what you're seeing is a massive push from the rest of the world and from a growing number of Americans who take some minimum morality seriously, or some ethics, whether you're religious or not with your ethics. There is something wrong about the United States storing millions or hundreds of millions of doses of this vaccine in warehouses when people around the world are desperate on a basis of life and death. And so, yeah, the pressure is mounting on Mr. Biden, as it would on any president. And the pharmaceutical...
President Trump did not, like, he got rid of our PPE stores. So the
Yeah.
idea of storing up vaccines is a good idea. Unfortunately, it seems like it's a trade issue that we give pharmaceutical industries or pharmaceutical corporations the proprietary right to be the only ones who can make a vaccine, who can save the world from a pandemic. And that seems to be not exactly the United States' fault, but it's the fault of the rules that the United States was part and parcel of making. There are other countries, European countries, who are dead set against lifting these restrictions, where President Biden has at least said, I think we should lift these restrictions. That's kind of, I hope the Brazilians don't hate us forever and see that this is part of the conversation.
You're right, Juliana, but there's a little bit more to this story. The Europeans, like the Indians and the Chinese, have been exporting their vaccines. The United States has not. So that's one of the reasons the Europeans, they're not so eager to share the patent, because that would destroy their market for their exports. Here in the United States, it's actually a little easier to relax the patent because we haven't been exporting anything anyway. Here, it's just the greed of the pharmaceuticals who don't want to establish the precedent that in matters of life or death, you shouldn't have a patent. Let's remember what a patent is.
It's still greedy in Europe. I think it's even more greedy in Europe because it's there. That's where the pharmaceutical industries are based. So they have a personal stake in letting the pharmaceutical industries maintain their, dominance and keeping something that is life-saving in the market, as opposed to being given out for the public good. Not just giving out the actual vaccines,
right,
is also a good idea, but letting people make the vaccines and making sure they have supplies in order to make vaccines. In India, they're making vaccines and shipping them to the United States. They should just open the door and hand them out.
Well, it's a fundamental kind of idea, the patent, that you're going to let the person who gets the patent have it exclusively for a certain number of years, 7, 9, 13, it varies. But that's always been one thing, namely to protect profits. And the fundamental question is, why are you allowing profits to function as a dominating factor when it's life or death, when it's our health? We should not have a system that subordinates the health of our people, of our fellow human beings, to the profit of what is always a small minority. I mean, seems to me that's a no-brainer. We should not allow a profit-driven capitalist system into our healthcare. It's not appropriate. It's not appropriate in food. It's not appropriate in a whole bunch of basic things that human beings need. We should overcome this old idea that somehow the only way we can do things efficiently is if we have private enterprise getting a profit from doing it. This is a story that is told to children. It shouldn't be. And they tend to believe it all the rest of their lives. And here we're living through the most dramatic example imaginable of why that isn't a good idea.
Yeah, we try to teach our children to share, and then we're like, only if you have a little extra.
That's right.
Sharing doesn't really count unless it comes from you,
And I'm really worried. To be honest with you, Julia, I'm really worried. I think the rest of the world is going to be this is the old colonialism. This is the white, Western, rich, industrialized world, North America, Western Europe, Japan, taking care of themselves, using the resources, many of which originated in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, to take care of themselves and to let the rest of the world wallow around in sickness and poverty and diseases. I mean, and the cost of this in a modern world where everybody can see what's going on because telecommunications spread the word everywhere. My Brazilian friend knew more details about who's getting vaccines in the United States and who isn't than I did, because the information is distributed in this way. We cannot hide from the results of what is being done at this point.
It seems like what we're just hiding behind our enormous military industrial complex and our arms.
And that's not going to save us. I mean, let's be real honest. The same President Biden is the one who decided a few weeks ago that all the American troops left in Afghanistan will be withdrawn by September of this year with no conditions. Okay, I mean, I don't know how Americans are understanding this, but I make sure to read the French and German newspapers almost every day, which the internet makes easy for me to do. And I speak those languages so I can read in the French and the German. So let me assure you, the whole rest of the world knows what this means. It means that a 20-year war by the United States in Afghanistan ended with the defeat of the United States. I know Americans have a hard time wrapping their brains around such an idea, but the rest of the world sees $1 trillion, countless Americans and Afghanistani men, women, and children killed, wounded, coming home with PTSD and all the other things we understand, and we lost the war. That's one of the poorest countries on earth that defeated the United States.
Didn't we lose Vietnam too? I mean,
yes, basically we did. And Iraq is a lost cause too, and that's how the world sees it. And Americans can only hide.
Technically, but they got the oil out of it. So for the real reason for that particular war, it was a success.
Right. All wars, even those that we call defeats or those that we call victories, they're always mixed. Wars always have winners and losers. The people in this country who work in the defense industry, they won through the war. They sold all those rockets and missiles and guns and planes. For them, this was a profitable 20 years. For those American families who sent young men and young women over there, it's a disaster they'll never overcome for the rest of their lives. Yeah, winners and losers. But for the rest of us looking at all of this, the question has to be asked, unless you really are blind. Didn't we make a colossal mistake doing something that's good for the war machine, but for nobody else?
Then isn't that a plus for President Biden removing those troops? And also, could you speak to the fact that, you know, some people are concerned that he's removing the troops, but there's still going to be private mercenary armies at functioning there. So he's basically privatizing the war instead of ending it.
Right, and that was been going on for the whole 20 years. In other words, both Iraq and Afghanistan see more of what you began to see in Vietnam, which was the government getting out of the embarrassment of droning some marital wedding party or a picnic of a family and then getting the terrible publicity. It's always easier to blame some private army that are anonymous and you don't even know who it is. The government to say we didn't have anything to do with this, et cetera, et cetera. So the privatization has been going on a long time. And I'm afraid that Mr. Biden will be subject to the same pressures that President Trump was or that President Obama was, or all of them are. The power of the military and of the industries that serve the military is very, very well developed. We don't call them a military-industrial complex for nothing. They will push and they will get something too, even if there's a quote-unquote withdrawal. So, yeah, it could be privatized. We could be replacing it with a new war someplace else. The saber
Can't we just beat those arms into plowshares? I don't care if the military-industrial complex makes money, but just stop making weapons of destruction and start making things we can combat the climate crisis with. And then the whole world will be happy to have us on their soil. I don't understand why, it has to be so horrendous.
look, the majority of the American people agree with you. Instead of there being a debate, which is going on in Washington as I'm talking to you, instead of there being a debate, oh, gee, can we fund the infrastructure plans that President Biden has announced? Oh, no, we can't afford it. Well, if we stopped funding the military-industrial complex, we could afford everything that we're talking about, the greening of America, the infrastructure program, the American family program. All of these things wouldn't require a nickel of government extra borrowing, no more extra deficit, because we would move literally what you said in a concrete way, stop making guns and missiles, and make plowshares. Let me remind everyone.
I'm sorry for the last 200 years. Here are some solar panels. Note. I don't mean to make light. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. There's this one statistic that I love that comes out of a number of resources, but I use the Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. They have a wonderful institute up at Brown University that keeps track of spending on war and spending on armaments. The United States, here's a basic statistic, and this has been true for years. The United States spends more on what we call defense. You know, in Britain, it's called the War Department. In the United States, it's called the defense, because we're always defending. We would never attack anybody. Although how you would explain what happened in Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam by calling it defense, well, that's the kind of stretch we count on politicians for. But the reality is,
we're going to embargo us on the coconuts, so we had to defend. I'm sorry.
We spend more. The United States spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. And those 9 include Russia and China. The rest of them are allies of the United States. It's crazy. It's out of control. It's been irrational. I don't know if you follow these things, Juliana, but a few courageous senators and congressmen and women pressed the Army and the military to make an audit of what they do with all this money. They haven't been able to do it. They've tried for several years. They can't even find the records they need to do a proper audit. And that's because
they probably don't want to, admit to black prison, black sites, prison sites, and a lot of what they do. They don't want to put that as a line item.
Right. And they don't want to show you that, they made a contract. There was that famous one a few years ago where they made a contract for toilet, the folding down part of the toilet, where they had paid, I don't know, $800 per unit for their toilets, because that was a very comfortable, or they had bought screwdrivers at some gargantuan price, 10 times what you could get it at the local hardware store, et cetera, et cetera. I think we have to sooner or later come to terms with this. And it's going to be another one of those painful conversations, because Americans have been telling themselves these phony stories for so long that it's hard to break out of something, even if it's tall tale that you kind of half knew was nonsense for a long time.
This idea, I was talking about this with another guest, this idea of the very sensible people, the very serious people that you see on the Sunday morning talk shows. They're always a defense industry person or something like that. And those of us who would prefer peace get written off as, not serious, because we don't take seriously that other countries have it in for the U.S. or have negative kind of. How would you speak back to that kind of propaganda? Because I feel like it's in there. You say cut the military and people go, China, they're going to kill us. That you can give them the numbers about we spend more than, the top 9. Is that all we have to say? Like, hey, even if we stop spending today, we could still smush China if they decided to come over here. What do you say?
Well, I think one of the answers is to be honest about that we are the most militarily equipped country the world has ever seen. And we've been that way for a long time. And the only real question is, why are we doing all of this? If we're really interested in defense, then we could do what all those other countries do. Build up their military so that anyone who came and attacked them would pay a heavy, heavy price. That's what the word defense means. We don't have a merely defensive capability. And the American people are perfectly capable of understanding the difference between a defensive capability and an offensive one. But they also have to face the fact that the businesses of America that sell to the government for military equipment are among the biggest corporations in the United States. General Motors, General Electric, Apple, Amazon, they are all dependent in major ways on the government. That's why the whole world has been laughing over the last 2 years as the Trump administration, and now unfortunately Biden also, are fingering certain Chinese companies and saying, these companies have a relationship to the Chinese government. You're right, they do. But who in the world do you think you're fooling? Every major American corporation, really with a tiny number of exceptions, have a relationship with the American government. And that relationship includes military, espionage, and other kinds of activities. And that's been true for a long time. Indeed, in the rest of the world, there's a certain kind of wonderment that if the United States says you shouldn't buy telecommunications equipment from China because it could allow the Chinese army to spy on your country, well, then how are you buying American telecommunications equipment? Because it will allow the American government. There was a funny moment early in the Trump administration when he was appearing before the television cameras with Angela Merkel, the head of Germany at the time. And he made a joke, which nobody found funny, in which he referred her to a piece of information that he had proudly gotten earlier than she did because of the spying done by the United States on her cell phone. She wasn't pleased. Nobody in Germany was pleased. But, for the Germans then to hear later from the United States, you shouldn't buy Chinese telecommunications because they could spy on you, it makes the Germans have even less respect for the United States. And again, the long-term costs of this are much more dangerous than taking it easy on your overkill capacity in your Defense Department.
I do think that huge amount of defense that we have built up just gives the United States the idea that they can act with impunity, whether it's hoarding up the vaccines for Brazil or spying on Angela Merkel. It's like, well, we have all these weapons. So what are you going to do? You can be mad, and there's a short-sightedness and
right.
About the fact that the world could easily turn at any moment to make us less capable to defend ourselves than and if everyone's mad at us, this is not good. This is not a good way of being in a world where there are other people who aren't here just for us to destroy.
Well, it's also a historical lesson. Every other empire in the history of the human race overreached itself, tried to do more in the way of controlling its environment than it could manage. And in the effort, this overreach, they met their downfall. They fell apart. Look, the Soviet Union vanished, and it wasn't a coincidence that they had tried to build up the standard of living of their people and to compete with the United States on the nuclear arms race and to invade and control Afghanistan. Any one of them, maybe even any two of them, they might have pulled off, but they overreached, tried to do all of them, and the Soviet Union fell apart. The United States and Rome fell apart, and Greece fell apart, and the British Empire fell apart. What is it? What kind of crazy idea is it in the minds of Americans that they think what happened to every other empire isn't happening to the United States? We tried to control the history of Afghanistan, Vietnam, and Iraq, and we didn't manage it. This, you have to begin to wonder. Then we had a COVID, and we didn't manage that either. These are signs, folks. I wish I weren't the one to tell you about them, but then again, you already know. You don't need folks like us. You just need to have a bit more courage to face these realities and draw the logical conclusions.
Thank you so much, Professor Wolff. We'll leave it there on this topic. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Julianna, and I look forward to our talk next time.